first presenter, June. Flanagan is a Lethbridge botanist, horticultural consultant, author, and nature photographer. She is definitely a frequent visitor to Nikka Yuko Japanese Garden. This year and last year, he introduced us to Canada Garden Day celebration, which we have worked together to appreciate our garden team and Nikka Yuko Japanese Garden. June served as board of directors for the Lethbridge and District Japanese Garden Society, and in her term while she served on the board, she got to work with some of the founding members to develop and co-author the book, the Garden of Serenity book that we have at sale at our visitor center, as well as a copy for you to look at. So with no further more introduction, I'd like to introduce June. Please come on.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me? I have a soft voice, and I'm short, so I feel like I'm looking over the podium here. As Michelle said, I did work on a book about the Japanese garden. I had the really good fortune some years ago to be invited to document the history of the garden with one of its founding members, Robert Hironaka. This was a book of art photography that was taken in the garden by Christou. And as a former botanical garden specialist, I was really intrigued to learn the story behind building a Japanese garden on the Canadian prairie. And so the interviews began, and Robert and I met at a coffee shop in our public library for 2 hours every Tuesday morning to take notes. And his love for the garden ran so deep, and his memories of building it were so well described that our weekly meetings carried on for 2 years without a break. So in the end, we had a 200-hour story that had to be condensed into the book. So today, I'd like to share just a few highlights from his story, along with a photo collage that flips back and forth between the beginnings of the garden and how it looks now, to give you a sense of our place here in southern Alberta and how a Japanese garden was created 50 years ago. So Nikka Yuko began with 2 men who shared the same dream of building community by building a garden. A Buddhist priest, Reverend Kawamura, and a newspaper publisher, Cleo Mowers. And Reverend Kawamura had lived and studied in Japan, so he was very partial and familiar with the unique garden styles there. But when he moved to southern Alberta, the mountain and prairie landscape here in his new home inspired him so much that he wondered if this same scenery could be interpreted in a Japanese-style garden. And he dreamed of gathering his congregation together to build such a garden. Now, Cleo Mowers also wished to create a garden as a tribute to the contributions and many sacrifices made by Canadians of Japanese heritage here in southern Alberta. But it took a third man, Kurt Steiner, to launch the project. And as manager of Lethbridge's Tourist Association, he immediately recognized the potential to create a regional attraction and a legacy for our city. After these 3 men formed committees that did a lot of work and successfully received approval by our Lethbridge City Council and funding through Canada's Centennial Committee, they asked a respected Japanese landscape architect, Dr. Tadashi Kubo, from University of Osaka Prefecture, if he would design the dream into a reality. Now it was time to answer the question, what makes a Japanese garden? And how do we do it in another country in a different climate and culture? Now, the semi-arid Canadian prairie might seem an unlikely place to you to find a Japanese garden. But if the philosophy of Japanese garden design is to express the essence of nature, why not seek the signature of Alberta's landscape and express it in an artistic form? So, with that in mind, and with committee members in Lethbridge as guides, Dr. Kubo began an intensive study of southern Alberta, its land, its people, and their way of life. The design would involve learning new plants, factoring in a harsh winter climate, and defining how the garden would be enjoyed in a foreign land. As you said, connecting the people with the garden. Kubo explored our rugged mountains and our gentle foothills. And through conversations and observations, he became aware of our love of nature and the open blue skies here in Alberta. He made notes about native plants, and he paid particular attention to the shape, size, color, and texture of natural rocks here. And as he came to know the area and the people, Kubo gained an appreciation for our windswept grasslands and our tree-lined river valleys. And he became intrigued about this garden idea. So when he discussed his findings with Masami Sugimoto, his colleague in Japan, they agreed a garden could be built using Japanese principles and sensitive to the Canadian landscape culture and climate. And they decided Mas Sugimoto would lead the on-site construction while Professor Kubo tended to his teaching commitments in Japan. So the site for the garden was to be a section of a large city park here in Lethbridge next to a man-made lake that now provides this borrowed scenery for a lovely view, expanding the visual garden well beyond its physical boundaries. Now, when Kubo returned to Japan after his study of the landscape and the people here, he asked his senior students to suggest ideas for the garden. He described our region, and he described the garden site in detail, and also how he thought a garden might be used here in our culture. A pavilion would serve as a gathering space for celebrating Japanese and Canadian art and culture, and the surrounding garden would be a peaceful place to relax with a strolling path around a pond and a dry garden to stimulate the imagination. And this sketch was drawn by a young female student, Ayako Hitomi. It inspired Kubo's design, and it was actually incorporated in the master plan. Although she had never traveled to Canada and she had very little design experience, she had a very clear idea for the garden. So, construction began with Sugimoto overseeing the earth moving. And this started out being a very flat, grassy site in the park. And tons of soil were brought in to transform it into graceful rolling hills surrounding a central pond with an underground pump system that would circulate the water between the stream and the waterfall, tumbling into the quiet waters of this pond, which is newly planted in this photo. And fast forward 50 years, this is what it looks like today. Now, once the shape of the land was defined in the garden, Sugimoto's attention turned to the garden elements. And I'll begin with the rocks, because I had a chance to see the master plan blueprints with all the detailed drawings. There were drawings of over 600 desired rock shapes and sizes for building the shoreline, the mountain, the waterfall, and the stream. And the drawings showed where the rocks would be positioned, how they would fit together, the depth to which they would be buried, and what portion of each rock would be visible above the waterline from the shore. And these were all very artistically drawn in three-dimensional perspective with construction details. They're amazing. Mas Sugimoto searched for and discovered rocks just like those described in the drawings near the Crow's Nest Pass between Alberta and British Columbia. And after getting permission from the landowner, he had hundreds of these massive boulders embedded with colorful lichens moved by crane to the garden site. Later, these rocks were documented to be 60 to 70 million years old, meaning that ancient rocks would immediately bring the cherished character of age into a young garden. On site, the rocks were lined up in rows, and Sugimoto examined them individually before choosing which rock would go where. Now, the master plan was consulted and followed at every stage, but it was implemented, as every garden plan should be, from the ground up. Each rock was lifted into its designated place with a crane. It was inspected from all angles and repositioned until the desired effect was achieved. Meanwhile, the Canadians nervously watched, worrying that this time-consuming work would extend the project well beyond the budget. So here are the newly planted shorelines with the rocks in place, and now they're softened by mature plants. The garden structures were handcrafted in Kyoto of aromatic wood from the prized yellow cypress, a tree that's native to the foggy cloud forest in Taiwan. The structures were built in Kyoto, then they were dismantled and packed into 72 crates and shipped across the ocean to Canada. 5 master tradesmen traveled from Kyoto to reassemble the structures on site with assistance here from Canadian tradesmen. Everyone remembers and describes the fine craft work and the attention to detail. The copper for the roof was hand cut by an expert coppersmith to form the pavilion roof. And the floorboards inside the pavilion were made of yellow cypress that was planed by hand. Everything was done by hand. The pavilion was situated in the garden with as much care as the placement of the rocks. So again, looking at it from every angle. From the pavilion, you can see the dry garden. Its deliberately placed rocks rise among a bed of white chipped stones with a pattern raked in the stones to inspire contemplation, or perhaps evoke meaning. To me, this meaning would be mountains rising from the plain of rippled grass on a windy prairie. That's our sense of place. A special bronze friendship bell of the type that would be found in a Japanese temple was commissioned for the garden and cast in Kyoto, and it was inscribed with the names of the people who worked together to build the garden. And stone lanterns, such as this one you see by the bell tower, were carved by Kyoto artisans and positioned in significant places around the garden, according to tradition. Historically, these were used to light the garden path, but of course, after electricity arrived, they're now symbolic of lighting the way. A simple structure, open on all sites, was built so that visitors could sit in the shade beside the gentle flowing stream and admire the garden. Now, people in Lethbridge were getting pretty excited as they watched the construction of these elements go into place, and they wanted to help. And so one afternoon, about 40 volunteers gathered together for a pebble-picking picnic on the shores of the Old Man River near Monarch to gather these smooth, flat river stones, the small ones that you see right in here, that would be used to create the pebble beaches along the stream and around the pond. All the features in the garden were connected with the meandering stroll path. Every bend in the path purposely hides one view while revealing another to encourage you to explore its winding curves at a slow pace and reflect on every view as it unfolds. Now, to give the garden plantings a head start, people around southern Alberta rallied again, and they generously donated trees that were of some size. But even at this stage, it was hard to imagine the future of the forest. Hundreds of hardy trees and shrubs were planted, chosen to express our natural landscape, our forest, our meadows, our mountains, our plains, and to celebrate the changing seasons. Here the garden is in winter, and the beautiful blossoms in spring. Now, I've heard people say that the plants are indigenous in the garden, but most plants at Nikka Yuko are not native species. They are actually horticultural varieties with desirable characteristics and the necessary hardiness to tolerate the extremes of our climate. We also have native maples and pines and spruce and fir in our mountains and foothills, but these species are horticultural. However, the plantings are symbolic, and even though this expanse of grass doesn't include any native grasses, it evokes the vastness of our prairie, one of the largest vegetation zones in North America. And true to Kobo's vision, the garden is a tranquil oasis in a busy city, but it's much more than that. The pavilion is a hub of activities every week, from traditional Japanese arts, such as this tea ceremony during moonlight viewing, to events like photography workshops, yoga in the garden, and watching the fireworks from the garden on Canada Day. With the approach of our 50th anniversary, Nikka Yuko is acquiring the patina that can only occur over time. And the plants in the garden have grown significantly from those early days. After the garden was established, Robert Hironaka met the student who sketched its initial concept. When Ayako Hitomi visited, she told Robert that she was surprised that the mountains were so far away from Lethbridge, because she had imagined from Kobo's descriptions that they would be seen from the garden. But the rest of the landscape in the garden was captured just as she had envisioned. I think it's fitting to finish with one of Bob's favorite scenes in the garden. His stories taught me a lot about the philosophy of Japanese garden design, and it gave me a real appreciation for seeking the signature of our landscape and finding the essence of nature so that it could be symbolized artfully in a landscape design. He made me much more aware of how Lethbridge came together, how the people could gather together and create an international symbol of friendship and a model of enrichment by intertwining Japanese and Canadian culture in a garden. What do you think? I believe Nikka Yuko demonstrates that with a thoughtful approach and a sensitivity to the local landscape and people, a garden of serenity in the Japanese style can be created anywhere, in any culture, in any climate. So thank you very much. I'd also like to mention that most of the photographs in this presentation were not mine, and so I would like to thank all of the photographers. Many of them are anonymous. Michelle gave me a wonderful collection of photos that the garden has, and we believe that this might be a photo that Robert Hironaka took. I do remember he had a very large copy of it framed in his living room, and I used to love to go and chat with him and look at the garden at this beautiful time of year, which you're very lucky to experience too. So does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? I wanted to give you just a brief overview of the garden because many of the other speakers are going to be giving you many more of the details that are involved in it. Yes?
So from groundbreaking to the actual start of the garden, the opening of the garden, how long was that time period?
Oh, that's a good question. And Michelle, you might actually know better than I. I think that the I think it was 2 years from groundbreaking to the actual opening on July 14th, 1967, which was Canada's centennial, the 100th birthday of the country. But the planning actually started at least 2 years before that. All those meetings that I condensed into one sentence to get the funding and the approval that was a lot of work that went on for a couple of years.
2 years, that's fairly, knowing that, the local citizens were a little concerned about the timeline and, it coming together maybe in a slower fashion than they anticipated. 2 years pretty quick.
It was amazing. I think that there was a lot of talk before then, though, too. I think that this, as you know, these things don't happen overnight, but yes, that's the approximate official timeline. Yes.
Do you have any idea why there were not, more native plants used in the plantings in Nikka Yuko, i.e. rhododendron, the acers, even the pines that are local, and so on and so forth?
Right, that's an excellent question. Well, there would probably be many reasons. First of all, availability. Getting commercial or even having sources of these plants is not easy. Even now that people are much more using native plants in their landscapes, it's difficult to find them. Another question, or another reason would be, for example, we have a native maple that grows in the mountains in Waterton, but it's not the same size.
Please do share what the Latin names are.
Yes, it's an acer. I don't remember the species of it. Sorry, I'd have to look it up.
That's good.
Yeah, but it's a shrub rather than a tree. The species of maple in the garden it's a Tatarian maple. I think it's acer. It's either Guinella or is it Tataricum? Yeah. So, and it's an Asian species that is widely available here horticulturally. Actually, one of the maples you can find it native in eastern Canada, but it doesn't grow wild here. But it grows into a tree, whereas our native maple in the mountains is a shrub. And so it doesn't give you the right form and shape and size in particular to suit the site in the garden. So I think it's a question of availability, probably mostly, and also just finding the species that suit the character of what's needed where they're in the spot where they're growing. Yeah. Sorry, I should just say one more thing. There are horticultural selections, though, of some of our native species. For example, the potentilla. And I think we have dogwood, too, right? So the potentilla is Potentilla fruticosa. And dogwood would be Cornus. It's probably Sericea, but I don't know what species is in the garden. There's several, but those do grow wild here.
In turn, I was just thinking that the glabra is actually a little bit more of the West Coast or sort of British and Columbian, just over the border there. The maple is double. We do actually have some Janella or Janalian ones. Tartaricum is Tartaricum, but they've actually crossed over a long time ago. What I was really curious about, though, is that why we didn't use Ohio Malpighius culus, why we didn't use the Rhododendron alba, and some of the other closer ground covers, and why they weren't brought in. So did Bob say anything about that, or did Sugi Bob say anything about that, or in some portion? We have so much available, so the authenticity of the origin of plants is to go out in the mountains, pick up the young growth, and bring them all with them. Mm-hmm. So why didn't we follow that? Is there any notes on that?
I think that, you raised some really good points, and I'm really interested in native species myself, and so you're speaking to a kindred spirit. I think availability was a real challenge at the time, and also gathering that much plant material at one time. We didn't have, for example, now, we have a wonderful native plant grower just outside of Calgary, Bow Point Nursery, but they didn't exist 50 years ago. And so it was hard to get plants. I think people felt that they did well, even at that time, to the plant palette that was available for this climate was very limited. And I think
I'd just like to say we didn't have any conservation laws at that point in time, so we just sort of raped the local neighborhood.
Go and go out and dig them up, I know. Well, and you're right. I mean, people did do that. But again, if you were going to do that, for example, here, you would be digging poplars out of our river valley. And that may not have been the right form, size, and texture of plant that they wanted to use in the garden. So, yeah, it's a really good point, and it's really interesting. And I think it holds potential for future development of the garden. We can be thinking, now that we have more native plants available commercially, that we can, as plants grow and mature and the garden needs to be further fostered, that some of these plants could be replaced with native species. There's definitely potential to do that now that didn't exist 50 years ago. So, and maybe Masa and Al would like to speak on that too when they do their presentation. But that's my my understanding and my perspective is that availability. Yeah, really good question though. Yes.
Well, one brief comment on availability of those more mature trees that you mentioned being volunteers, but they weren't all so small. Bob's good friend Matt Nishiyama, his favorite story about the garden is moss showing up in front of his house down in Raymond. Bob may have been with him at the time and saying, "We want that tree. his main tree in his front yard. They took it and just left this big gaping hole that
Yeah, right, yes.
So much was volunteered and availability was an issue.
Yeah.
They were proactive.
Well, there were hundreds of plants donated by citizens, and not just here in Lethbridge and in Raymond, but as far away as Brooks in Calgary. I mean, they came from all over. People were really behind this, and the generosity and the spirit of getting involved was really strong. But again, what they gave what they had, and our plant palette was a lot more limited 50 years ago. We have many more things that have been brought in, have been tested, have been developed, have been selected. We have much more now available to us. And we have more access to the native plants. People know how to propagate them. So we could go in a different direction in the future. Yes?
So were there any species or types of trees that were tried and didn't succeed that were first part of the garden that you know around?
Well, I don't know that detail specifically, but again, Al and Masa might.
Within the first 10 years, most of the Scotch pine on the hill died.
And do you think that was transplanted?
Contaminated soil underneath.
Yeah,
It was built upon.
yeah.
So they excavated some rather large planting pits and filled it with better soil and then replanted.
Yeah.
And so these are kind of the second group.
Looking at photos, I've seen a lot of evolution of the garden, and it goes back to what we speak of as fostering, which is really, it's actually a philosophy. One of the principles of Japanese garden philosophy is fostering the growth and guiding the growth of the garden, because if you want to maintain that original design, this is a living, growing, changing piece of art that you constantly need to keep after. So yes, replacing plants would have been a thing. Yes?
What type of rocks are those? Are those granitic or,
Volcanic? Are they?
It's a sandstone.
Yeah.
Correct, it's saltwater.
Yes, thank you.
oh, saltwater?
Yeah, it's a little bit different actually in the malleability and how the bracts break down over time.
So this was all underwater?
Yes, absolutely. We're bottom of our ocean floor. Kendall had a question over that.
Yes.
Kendall has a farm.
To move from horticulture to the people, I'm really interested in the female student of Professor Kubo.
Yes,
In the
so am I.
60s, a woman in landscape architecture in Japan.
At that time.
And then to be chosen. When did she come here? I would love to interview her if you have a connection with her. And did she go on to a career in Japan, or was this just a one-of-a-kind?
Well, I know very little about her. It was Robert mentioned this same story that I told you to me. I found very little written about her. I'm really curious too, because it's very unusual for a woman, particularly at that time in Japan, to be studying landscape architecture. I believe she visited here about 12 years after the garden opened, so I think it was about 1979. And Robert gave her a tour of the garden. And I'm not sure, the way he tells me is that he was giving her and her husband a tour of the garden, and she seemed to know much more about it and be much more interested than most people that he would give a tour of. And he just had a feeling, now this is how he tells me, that he did not know that it was her ahead of time, that he had a feeling that it must have been her, and he actually asked her. And she was so humble about her position and her role in developing this sketch for the garden that she didn't even want to answer his question, and actually her husband answered the question and said, yes, she did draw the sketch. That's all I know. I would love to know more too. I would love to meet her and talk to her. We've talked about this, Michelle and I. It's an intriguing part of the story. If anybody else knows, it would be wonderful. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Masa.
Do you have a detailed drawing of elevation of each shoreline, how to build?
You know, I think those would have been in the master plan, in the blueprints.
I
And
think that really introduced the ability of the architect who can draw
yes,
the detailed elevation drawing of each stone's configuration. And then Sugimoto, very close to execution of the placement and the selection of the stone, has been implemented very close to the drawing. I saw the drawing.
yes, I did
I
too.
was shocking
I
how
agree.
precisely drawn as elevation detail.
Right. And they were three-dimensional, right? They
Right.
weren't just, it
So
was,
please prepare next presentation, wherever you will be, to show.
I can bring those tomorrow. How about I bring them?
Oh, yeah, that's a
backwards
good idea.
tomorrow, and I'll have
That's
them out
a good
for
idea.
people to look at.
yeah, they're amazing. The ones I saw, Tosh Hanashiro has copies of the blueprints, and I saw them, and I just, yeah, they're amazing. They're beautiful, and it's amazing that someone can visualize all of that detail, and that Sugimoto could go out and then find the boulders. That was no small task either. That took quite a bit of an adventure around southern Alberta looking for the boulders, and then find all of those 600 boulders and rocks and bring them into the garden, and then place them, as you said, according to where they should be positioned. It's a feat that just boggles my mind. So anyway, anything else? Thank you very much.
I want to present you with this little stone lantern to light up the rest of your way.
Oh, thank you so much.
Al White is the artist of this, so I want to give it.
Thank you, Al. That's wonderful. Oh, I'll treasure that. Thank you so much, and thank you, Al.
Speaking about rocks, this main rock here, this big one, it weighs 17 tons, so 3 elephants heavy. And the story behind that rock was using the old-fashioned crane. Dr. Sugimoto was on the side, and it was a Canadian crane operator at the time with this big old truck. And they were lowering this 17-ton rock, and literally, it took about 3 or 4 hours of Dr. Sugimoto going to the right 2 inches, to the left 2 inches. The crane operator was getting madder and madder as this process went along, and they finally had a talk after a while, and then they worked together for that placement of the rock. That was quite a story, and I think Dr. Sugimoto, when he comes to visit, he always smiles when he sees that rock, so I think he remembers all the conversation for the placement for that. So